So welcome everyone. I'm Davis Jenkins, Senior Research Scholar at the Community College Research Center, joined by my colleague Hana Lahr and our Washington colleagues, Dr. Rosie Rimando and Dr. Matt Campbell. You can just call him Dr. Rosie, Dr. Matt. In this session, she's here. Hana and I are going to be summarizing some of the lessons we learned from two major evaluations we conducted over the past several years of guided pathways, including with colleges in Washington. Hana's going to talk a little about the adoption patterns in Washington State, and then Dr. Rosie and Dr. Matt are going to talk with Hana about what we've learned, what you guys see as the next frontiers. As you know, Hana and me, we're from New York. We show each other we love each other by not just being nice. You guys out there are too nice. So we welcome all comments and rebuttals, et cetera, in the chat, and feel free to raise your hand and stop us. We'll leave time at the end for questions, but again, intersperse them. So next slide and next slide. So that's the overview of this webinar. Next slide. And maybe you can introduce yourselves in the chat too while I'm yabbering. Thank you. So the guided pathways framework was really just that. In fact, is in 2015 when we published Redesigning America's Community College, it was very much a theoretical framework. It came out of work we had done earlier through a number of initiatives, including work in Washington State. But at the time, very few institutions had really, there were pieces that had been implemented, but no one really had implemented the whole thing. Some of the most developed models were actually among four-year institutions. Next slide. So over the past, since 2015, 8 or 9 years, we've had the honor and the privilege of working alongside the field in what probably is one of the biggest whole college reform movements in higher ed in a long time, with you, our colleagues in Washington and other states and national institutions, national organizations throughout the country. We recently came out, as I mentioned, Hana and I with Tom Brock, of the lessons we've learned from two major evaluations of guided pathways, and I'm going to turn to the findings now. Next slide. So the big questions were, to what extent do colleges adopt a set of guided pathways at scale that is for all students, and what do they adopt and how feasible is it, and is adoption associated with improvements in student outcomes? Next slide. There were two evaluations we conducted, 30 colleges participating in the ACC Pathways project, which included sorry, that was my mom calling to remind me how little I know about sports. The ACC Pathways project included 3 Washington College, Pierce, South Seattle, and Skagit Valley. And then we looked with funding from NSF at adoption and effects statewide in Ohio, Tennessee, and Washington. Next slide. In both cases, we examined the scale of adoption of an integrated set of guided pathways practices. And by scale, we mean were these practices adopted for all or most, in this case, entering students, because we were focused on near-term outcomes, not including running start or dual enrollment students, because colleges have only since been applying guided pathways practices more recently to those students. And we looked at across the four pillars, if you will, efforts to map workforce and transfer programs, mapping transfer programs to a major, like your subject-specific transfer pathways and your ASTs, your workforce programs and math programs. And we also looked at efforts to help students incoming explore interests, connect with people, develop a plan, an educational plan, and looked at advising, ongoing advising by field. And learning is hard to, from the kind of surveys that we did, measure. So we focused here very much on the implementation of co-requisite remediation in mathematics with math pathways as a key kind of practice that's been associated with improved outcomes. Next slide. In both cases, we looked at early momentum metrics, which research by CCRC and others have shown are strongly correlated with longer term success. And in particular research we've done, our colleagues John Fink and others did using data from Washington, we found that the effects of early momentum are especially strong for students of color, low-income students, and academically unprepared students, but too few of students, in those underrepresented groups achieve early momentum. Once they get on a path, they're cranking. They crank as well, if not better, as other students. We're particularly interested in credit accumulation, that is college level credits, completing English and math in the first year, especially college math, and persistence from term to term and year to year. Next slide. So we looked at measures of adoption at scale of these practices, singly and in combination with each other, and looked at improvements in early momentum metrics in the case of the ACC study using data reported by the colleges, the 30 colleges that participated. In the case of the NSF study, the 3-state study, using state administrative data, unit record data provided by Washington State, Tennessee, and Ohio. Next slide. So the ACC project, again, 3 Washington colleges were involved: Pierce, South Seattle, Skagit Valley. Were selected in a very competitive process. Kay McClenny and Gretchen Schmidt, if you know them, you don't want to mess with them. They were really looking for colleges at the time that were really willing to commit to really being involved in a national R&D project to figure out what these theories, what they would look in practice. And they went through 6 intensive institutes and coaching in 2016 and 17. And we collected from these colleges 8 years of data from 2012 to 2020. Next slide. So of the 30 colleges, one college, just while they made the initial commitment, they had turnover and there wasn't on sustained commitment from the faculty and others. So we're really looking at 29 colleges that stayed in this and really made strong efforts. 11 colleges had adopted all or most of the practices at scale in our model. Next slide. Next. 12 colleges were in the process of scaling. That is, they had made substantial progress on all or most of these practices, but in 2021, by 2021, they were still in the process. Next slide. 6 colleges made some progress on some of the practices, in particular onboarding and helping students develop a plan, but they did not scale co-requisite remediation, or that's a short way of saying they didn't get rid of prerequisite remediation and provide academic support. in the college level courses and develop and adopt math pathways. So among the 29 of the 30 colleges, this is how it shook out in terms of adoption. Next slide. So generally across the colleges, we saw improvements in most of the metrics. Next point. Colleges that made the most progress in scaling an integrated set of practices in our model in the AACC project, we used the more formative scale of adoption that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. If you hate it, I'm sorry, but it's been very useful to us in the field to understand what's going on and used as a formative tool. But those colleges that really adopted saw on most of the measures a substantial a higher rate of increase in the early momentum, and I'll show you that. Term persistence in general decline, most likely due to COVID, as we saw nationally. Next slide. We saw improvements, and again, I'll just show you this in a minute, but we saw improvements among all student groups by race and other factors, but gaps in achievement, especially by race, persisted. So in other words, we saw improvements for Black students, but the rates for white and Asian and other students increased as proportionally. So we didn't see a closing of the gaps. Next slide. So here's an example of the three groups of colleges: the fully scaled colleges, the scaling in progress as of 2020, and then those that made progress on some of the scaling but still hadn't really tackled the math reform, developmental math reform. And here, in looking at completion of 12 college level credits, this is 12 semester credits. We converted the Washington colleges data to quarter credits, but it's, I think, similar number in Washington for a first quarter. And you see that group that had fully scaled this work, seeing this much higher rate of improvement in early momentum around credit accumulation, 12 plus credits in one term. Next slide. In a similar pattern for 24 or more semester college level credits in a year, this translates to about 36 quarter credits in a year. We see a higher rate of return, or higher rate of improvement for the more fully scaled colleges. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, so here's this is the next slide, sorry. And the similar pattern with completion of college level math in 1 year. Much greater improvement among the students that had scaled practices, including the getting rid of prerequisite and providing academic support to students in college level courses. Next slide. We saw fairly flat persistence, and then as a result of COVID, a drop off among all of the colleges, which was a shock that every college in the country really had to deal with. Next slide. And as I mentioned, we see improvements for all students among these measures. And this one's looking at completion of 12 college credits in the first term. You see white students improve from 20% to 37%, whereas Black students, which that's the yellow line, the purple line is Black students from 8% to 21%, a substantial improvement, in terms of the relative percentage improvement, but still we see these gaps remain. And this is consistent with other research we've done on looking at effects for different student groups. Improvement overall, but still gaps overall remain. And we'll talk about that. Next slide. So the NSF project, 70 colleges from the 3 states. We used we have 10 years of data, unit record data from the 3 states. And in this case, rather than using that formative version of the scale of adoption, we used a institutional assessment that we piloted with colleges in the 3 states and got a very high response rate. 30 of 34 colleges in Washington State responded to the survey. And we used the survey, next slide, in conjunction with the administrative data to look at effects. So Tennessee had been at this longer than Ohio and Washington State. Washington State, although there were College Spark colleges involved in an earlier piloting effort supported by College Spark, which was important. We learned a lot. The real work and the funding from the legislature kicked off in 2018. So Tennessee and Ohio, but certainly Tennessee, have had a lot longer time to work on this, which is important in looking at the findings. Next slide. So we looked at high adopters, medium adopters, and low adopters. And this in Washington State, again, we're looking at 30 colleges out of 34. And you see, some variation across the states, but it's sort of in line as we would expect. And Hana's going to go into more detail on this. With Washington State starting later than the other 2. But in all 3 states, we did see, some number of colleges that that had adopted a full set and others that were, still in progress. Next slide. And again, we used the survey along with unit record data and our colleague, Veronica Manaya, who really hasn't been involved, who's a quantitative researcher, use these data to look at the effects of adoption at scale on early momentum metrics. In Tennessee, we observed positive changes in early momentum metrics in college credits earned, math credits, STEM credits, and fall-to-fall persistence. We did not see positive trends in Ohio and Washington overall. Next slide. We also looked at whether the adoption of any 5 practices, and again, this could be any 5 from the list of, I think, 14 practices, was associated with increases in outcomes. And we focused on the medium and high adopters, pre and post adoption. We collected data on when practices were implemented, but we didn't find any association between adopting at least any 5 practices and student outcomes in any of the 3 states. However, next slide, we used data mining to look at the effects of practices individually and practices of combinations of practices. And there's obviously, as you know, the theory of guided pathways is you've got to put together an aligned set of practices. And while what we found was practices connected, implemented in concert with one another, especially those designed to help students get into a program, plan a program, and follow and continue on a program, were associated with positive outcomes or early momentum outcomes in colleges in the 3 states. Next slide. One-offs don't work. Yes, thanks, Rihanna. So we found in all 3 states, we found that combinations matter. Especially important, and I think Hana will talk about this, is area 3, which we defined as case management advising by field, and at least among some vanguard of colleges, scheduling based on students' plans. So colleges that had not only done the mapping, the onboarding, and then the ongoing advising by field, and in some cases scheduling, we saw the strongest outcomes. Next slide. So whole college reform is possible. We know this is a lot of work. It takes 5 to 7 years of consistent leadership. Like we predicted, we theorized, when you put together a complementary set of practices, you can't just scale discrete practices, as is mentioned in the comments. You've got to redesign at scale. And we're seeing positive association between adoption of practices, especially those that focus on the 3 areas of mapping, onboarding, ongoing advising by field, and co-requisite remediation in math. We see improvements for all students, but not, no closing of the gaps in general. So next slides. So just briefly, and we can get into this, and Matt and Rosie are experts on this because they led efforts which were really focused on equity centrally, more so than many colleges nationally. Looking forward based on these evaluations and other research, colleges really got to, if they care about equity, they got to focus on these following 4 or 5 practices. Number 1, next slide. Facilitate case management. It's not enough to get students onboarding, which is important. We see great efforts by colleges and on a plan, but we have to make sure that they can finish their programs in a reasonable time and on schedules appropriate for very, very busy working adults who are the vast majority of our students who have little time for school and lots of else going on. This was a very strong practice. It's important to remove the obstacle of student success created by prerequisite remediation, especially in math. But we also found that, so what we're saying is we need to, but co-requisite itself isn't a silver bullet. Just, providing academic support isn't a silver bullet. We really have to focus on teaching. Next slide. Not just in the math and composition, but across program gateway courses like anatomy and physiology, and American civilization and STEM courses. Success in these courses is just as important, and it's easy to say, but it's hard to do. There's so much good evidence showing that the biggest effects on equity is in strengthening teaching. I always think, it's not so much that it's certainly not our students aren't talented. They just haven't experienced good teaching. I say that, however, knowing this is extremely difficult, especially given community college faculty and staff with such limited resources. Next slide. And because, the effects of, I don't have to tell you guys, the inequities start by students' station of birth. We got to reach down into the K-12 schools and use similar practices to build on-ramps for students. And this is one of the key focuses of CCRC's work moving forward. So I'll turn it over to Hana now just to talk briefly about some of the findings on the adoption of practices in Washington, then we'll have a discussion.
All right, so I'm going to share a little bit on Washington, just to give you a couple more specifics. When we look just at the Washington colleges, what we see is that they made the most progress on scaling the program mapping practices. So this includes transfer and workforce programs. This isn't surprising when we think about guided pathways reforms and what we and other organizations really emphasized early on. It was on mapping our programs of study. And this is where we saw a lot of progress in Washington. Washington colleges were also ahead of earlier guided pathways adopters in terms of scaling advising and giving students early program exposure. So that is about getting students into courses that are in their program of study, the program that they're interested in. And we looked at when we look at like within the Washington colleges, some of the later adopters made the least progress in terms of scaling the monitoring and planning practices. So that's monitoring students along their plan and helping them make educational plans, and also in implementing co-requisite math practices. I do know there have been, and we heard this a lot from the Washington colleges, some of the challenges with the advising technologies in the state. I think that has definitely had an impact on the progress in this area as well. But those are kind of some of the themes we saw when we dig into the Washington data. This chart, we'll send you the report when this is over, just to make sure that you can go into more detail on it. But here are the 30 colleges in Washington that filled out the assessment. And if you look up and down is a college, and left to right are the practices. So what you can see, just like eyeballing this, is that colleges are making more progress in some of those practices in like the upper right-hand corner. So that's the meta majors, the program maps, transfer program maps. And the colleges that made the most progress there were also more likely to scale some of these other practices. Some of the ones where we didn't see as much progress, down at the bottom, again, on like progress monitoring, scheduling for on-time completion, which is a challenge nationally to kind of figure out how to do that. But you can sort of see, just like by eyeballing this, where we're seeing the most progress in the Washington colleges. One thing to note, these data are now, a couple of years old. We collected these data several years ago, so it might look a little bit different now. We were just coming out of, COVID when we conducted this assessment. That definitely put a break on a lot of the progress colleges were making. As Davis said earlier, like, we do estimate that this takes 5 to 7 years. And if the statewide work was really ramping up in 2018, COVID happened in 2020, it was definitely an obstacle to progress in the state. This is also another way of looking at some of the data. Again, this is just looking at the Washington colleges. And this is the percent of colleges that had scaled certain practices. So here you can look to see that 50% of the Washington colleges had scaled meta majors as of fall 2022. A little bit more than half had scaled CTE program maps. A little more than 70% had scaled math pathways. So you can see here, just eyeballing it, where are the colleges overall making the most progress, and where is there still progress to be made in this work. And then just to dig a little deeper into area 2, what we see is a big opportunity here for advising and onboarding. The challenge, as I mentioned earlier, is some of this technical infrastructure. We saw some progress in this early program content through advising and onboarding, which was really encouraging to see. And we saw that this really scaled up rapidly between 2018 and 2022, which we could see based on the dates that colleges were putting into this assessment that we administered. Scaling up these practices really do rely on some of these technological resources. So this was a little bit more limited, which may have kind of hindered some of the progress there. And then this is another way of just looking at the adoption of these practices over time. And you can see the kind of steady adoption prior to when this work really got started, and the pretty swift adoption of some of these practices starting in 2018, 2019, when the work was really gearing up across the state. And these graphs are all in the report as well, so you can dig in more into those. This is also the same graph, but for the advising work. And you can see here really the scaling up of this caseload advising by field. We saw that was something that really the Washington colleges had made a lot of progress on, and that was really getting scaled up over time, with the progress monitoring being something that was still more in progress at the time that we administered this assessment. Let's basically just say what I just said. All right, so with that, we'll share the report, like I said, so you can dig in more into that. But I want to invite Matt and Rosie to join me, and we're going to have a discussion about, their perspectives on guided pathways reforms, where they're going next. And we particularly want to focus on equity in teaching and learning, because these are two critical pieces of the guided pathways framework. And with the work in Washington really having a strong equity focus, I think that there's a lot that colleges across the country can learn. And so we thought it would be great to have a discussion just starting here today about this work. So Rosie and
And
Matt, would you
Hana,
like
there
to
were
join
some
me?
questions in the chat about leading and sustaining, consistent leadership and sustaining these reforms moving forward, given the turnover we see in community colleges. So I think you got two
Yeah,
great respondents on that too.
definitely. Okay, we will dig into that as well. All right, so let me pull up my questions. All right, so Rosie and Matt, let me give you an opportunity just to reflect on what you shared before we dig into some of my questions. Any high level takeaways or thoughts that you had in listening to this?
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. First, I just want to say hello. There's many of you in this audience. I wanted to point out for Hana and for Davis that there's many of folks that are just in this group that have been involved with the Washington effort from day one. Either and not just those of us from Skagit or Pierce or South Seattle College, but others who were involved in the coaching aspect of it and in the support work that we were doing then. So just want to acknowledge there's a lot of depth of experience, at least within our own state system here in the audience today. So grateful for you folks who've been involved, including Pete, including Jamelyn and several others. As I'm listening to this, I'm really reflecting over the last several years of what it's meant to lead basically kind of a suite of intervention-based transformations and how that really turned into a good forcing function to consider truly whole system change. Because really, and Davis, I wonder if when you first were writing the book, if you were identifying these what we now call essential practices that led to positive outcomes in other settings. But what it really forced us to realize is that we were not necessarily a system at the time that was ready for the true whole system change that was going to be required to actually implement these things. And I use the analogy of, and I think about as you're showing us how particular outcomes have played out over time through the different implementation of interventions. I think about the difference of moving my place of living, the difference between when I first moved out and went to college for the first time. And in my case, went to go live in a dorm and it could fit in a Honda Civic, right? And then each time I moved, yeah, I could kind of, if my Tetris skills were good, as a young person, young adult, new professional, I could still kind of fit it in my Honda Civic at the time. And then as my life grew more complex, and so I think about that as if we were just trying to change one thing, or if our college was super, super tiny, and we were trying to change everything in a really tiny college, which none of us are. But really, if we're just trying to change one thing, yeah, you might be able to fit it all into a Honda Civic, get all the right people in the car, get everything packed away neatly, and move it over to this new iteration. But as my life became more complex, I thought about the last time I moved with a baby in tow, my mother with us, and a number of other things. Trying to reconcile a lifetime of resisting hoarding culture in our first generation Filipino family, it just got so much more complex to move. And I think about that when we might have thought, oh yeah, you got to move the bedroom, you got to move the bathroom, you got to move this, but you take it all together and it is this whole process. So before I get lost in a messy analogy, I think about that when I think about what we've actually tried to accomplish over the last, 7 years. Of really trying to do this work as a system and really in earnest is that we have been trying to move not just one house over, but 34 houses over with the same goal in mind and attempting to do it at a similar pace, if not the same pace. And so as I think about that and how we move as a state, much less how we move as a nation towards this, I think it really got us moving. The guided pathways work really got us moving to transition from a suite of interventions that have strong outcomes to whole system change that includes and embraces those original interventions and those that we've discovered along the way. So very much still in progress for true guided pathways reform. And I think we have to continue to think about it as a path and a journey that we're on, not as this destination that we're arriving at. You know, we report on it and we're done and we move on to the next thing. It's not at all like that. And I think those on this call probably already agree with that. But I think that's an important shift for us that we've had to make over the last several years.
Yeah, I totally agree. What are your kind of initial reflections, and as you're thinking about that, you know, what do you think what reforms, Pierce, do you think have had the biggest impact, or, you know, on the student experience?
So I don't think I can top a Honda Civic Tetris metaphor, but I was thinking of that idea of, like, it can't be just moving the bathroom, right? Like you were talking about moving all the rooms. You can't just pick, oh, we're going to move the bathroom and everything. We transformed, right? So I think I'd start by echoing something that I think you framed early in this and framed in those reports as well. And that's the caution about approaching guided pathways as piecemeal, that you can pick one and choose reforms rather than approaching it as whole system transformation. And I think that's really what Rosie was talking about just now. Along those lines, if I look at us at the beginning, I think it's we've always at Pierce framed this as sort of an everything is concept. That is, for quite some time, I don't think we've really looked at it as specific actions being part or not part of guided pathways. Rather, guided pathways is the framework in which we do our work to advance the mission of the college. It's a framework as much as it is a collection of things or a checklist. I get that a lot coaching, like, hey, we've done mapping, we've done pathways. Like, well, no, let's think about what other pieces are impacted by that. So within that framework, the 4 pillars really helped us organize that work. And while I'm a little hesitant to name specific things, I think we have talked about some of those pieces where we really can see impact, but I just want to temper that against the idea that these things don't stand alone. Like, you can't do this work without also doing work in pedagogy. You can't do this work with also transforming something in advising. But some of the big things, I'd say we had to engage in reframing our pre-college course sequence, right? So now we're in a place where we've reduced that to practically nothing. Like 95% of our students, through guided self-placement, place into college level with or without co-requisite, and are successful at the same rates or higher than they were when they tried to navigate 4 courses getting to the college level, and we lost a ton of students in those 4 courses. So that was really huge. Second, I think I'd point to the mapping that we really worked from the goal. Like, the goal of this is career for students. Like, students are thinking, what's the end game for me here? They're not coming to the community and technical college system to spend time and build friends. I mean, we want that to happen. We want to build that environment, that ecosystem where that happens. But students are coming to us because they want to see social mobility. They want to see economic mobility. They want to see justice in their communities. And so I think we started with the career and worked our way backwards. So rather than mapping to traditional programs, we said, well, what are the careers that students are going to get if they pursue this program? What are the knowledge, skills, and abilities they need in those careers? What are the outcomes that get to those knowledge, skills, and abilities? Now, what courses provide those outcomes? So that really provided a different approach to mapping, that rather from ground up, we were really looking at what's the end and backwards planning to get to really the right courses. So you could tell a student with transparency, this is why this course is important. Because otherwise, if you ask the student why they're in course X, it's like, because it's on my map. And that's the wrong answer, right? You want them to be able to say, this gives me the communication skills that I need in order to be able to be engaging in an international business environment. So whatever that might be, being that transparent. Lastly, I'd point to how we've centered equity in this work, which is something that I think we'll talk about throughout this panel, but I think it's most visible in our inclusive pedagogy, in our hiring and tenure processes, and some other places. But I know we have other questions where we're going to really poke at some of those pieces. So I'll leave some of that conversation for that. But I think we have to be intentional and explicit about equity in this conversation, and it's not an afterthought. But again, I'll hold for the moment and turn to Rose.
Yeah, I appreciate the way you talked about the mapping process, because I think there's a couple ways to approach program mapping. One is just to be like, all right, we're going to list out the courses that are part of this program and kind of taking the program as it is. And another is to think about, what is this program leading to? What are we preparing students to do? And then going back and looking at the program and the courses that are in the program and thinking about, are these the right courses? Are we helping students build the knowledge and skills and get the experiences that they need to be successful in this program? So Rosie, let me turn it to you and ask you about, how you've centered equity in this work, because you've been involved. We were attending institutes back in 2016 together. And so can you just talk about how you've made equity really central to the Pathways work at the Seattle colleges while still focusing on large scale reforms to onboarding, advising, and teaching? Like, how do you do all of this while centering equity in the work?
Well, I think that our early guided pathways experiences for me as a professional and as a leader, it really helped me develop the language for how we really need to center equity in all of the work that we do. And I've been really happy to see how we've evolved the use of the language here in the state. And so I remember early on, and I've told the story multiple times, so I apologize for those who've heard it already, but we were at, I think it was I don't remember if it must have been a Washington State convening. And we overheard our colleagues at Skagit talking, and we did a little breakout room and they presented, and they had this quote that really just spoke to us at South. And Pete was in the room at the time. Pete Lortz was in the room at the time as well. And it was that guided, and it's similar to a way that Matt described guided pathways, but guided pathways is the framework by which we will create equity. And so it's this idea early on, our Skagit colleagues really gifted me with the language to say, oh, this is what we're trying to do. We're not only trying to move the bathroom. We're not only trying to improve advising. We're not only trying to build a program map. We are doing all these things in service to creating more equitable outcomes, more equitable education. And so that sense of justice, I think, really spoke to me personally. And when I can remember sitting around with our team that day and during team time, which was always my favorite of our guided pathways convenings. And when we talked about it in that way, that it is the framework by which we will achieve equity, it created this idea that made equity something that was possible within our lifetimes. Whether true equity is going to be achievable in our lifetimes or not is a big question, but that there was a sense that we could do something that was really going to change something that mattered to everyone at the table. And I remember describing the body language. When we started talking about that, people they sat up, they either kind of sat up and were like, oh yeah, that's it. They're leaning in to engage, or they kind of sat back like, oh, like they're taking it in, like, oh yes, this is what we can do here. And so I think that was an early indicator to me of how we really needed to pair the concept of creating equity, creating racial equity, creating equity in outcomes with the work that we would be seeking to do with guided pathways. So I think that was ultimately helped. And so that was language we started using within South Seattle College at the time. And then as the statewide effort grew, under the leadership of Jan Yoshiwara, former executive director for the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges, the state board adopted a vision statement that the opening statement is, we don't even have to remember the rest, because the opening statement is leading with racial equity. And then goes on to make the vision statement. But that concept started to embed itself around us. And that, I think, for many of us across the state, sort of set us, it was sort of the call to action to go forth and do all those things that is best for our students. And in so many ways, they paired well with the essential practices that were called out in the Guided Pathways framework. So I think that through sort of being in the early days of embedding that language and how we were talking about it and approaching it, it also, I felt like we could lead from the middle across the state. And then now all of us in the state are rowing in the same direction. So I know I sort of didn't quite answer the question about how we were doing it at our particular college, but I am really, I'm really impressed and proud of the way that we as a state sort of took on that lift together. And so even though we're at different levels of achievement in terms of the implementing specific practices and outcomes, we are all moving in the same, rowing in the same direction, which is a huge feat across 34 very different, very diverse colleges.
Yeah, I want to jump on that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Hana. I'll start on that one piece and sort of circle back around and end in that same place, which I do think when the state board identified that vision statement that started with leading with racial equity, and that really came from the Guided Pathways Advisory Council, the GPAC. Like in that, there was a lot of conversation. I'm not saying it came out of that, because I think it actually came out of a state board retreat where they actually finalized that. But I know there was a lot of conversation in the GPAC of how this impacted Guided Pathways. When you ask, like, how do we keep this centered in the institution? Like, I think it has to be centered because it's mission. So at Pierce, like equity, diversity, belonging are explicit and intentional in our mission, in our budget, in our policy and procedure making and review. Like we're always in that same way, we're trying to front that conversation. It can't be an afterthought or an addendum. Like, let's do Guided Pathways and then let's think about equity within it. I think that's where we often fall down, particularly on resourcing equity work. It often comes after. Then a resource is spent and it's deprioritized, whereas if it's fronted, it's prioritized. If it's integrated, it's unavoidable. And so that resourcing becomes a natural part. With regard to Guided Pathways, I actually think we did start without fully and intentionally integrating equity, both locally and at the state level. In 2015, like, I think we thought we were doing good equity work, that it would be a natural outcome of Guided Pathways, but it was really an equality approach. We were building and replicating the racist systems that had existed in education for eons. We were adding transparency to that. And I think we were surprised when it didn't disproportionately impact those who had been most marginalized, but it benefited everybody. And it wasn't until we saw those data that we doubled our graduation rates for all students. We maintained the persistent inequity of outcomes, most visibly for Black and brown students. So that's exactly what, you know, Davis referenced early on, was it improved, but it did not close gaps. That's when we shifted to be extremely explicit and intentional in our work to advance Black and brown students and employee excellence. I think this goes to thinking both about Guided Pathways as the work, and that equity, diversity, belonging, like the state board's vision statement, leads that work. I'll talk more about that again in sort of, when we talk about ensure students are learning, like that idea that we're not just talking about ensure students are learning, and students is a vague concept, right? Because when we go to vague concepts, we go to white students, we go to dominant students, we go to how we've always functioned. If we change ensure students are learning to ensure Black and brown students are learning, that fundamentally is intentional, it's purposeful, and it really changes what we're thinking about with regard to curriculum, with regard to outcomes, with regard to pedagogy, with regard to advising, with all of the elements of Guided Pathways, all the elements of our institutions. But if we're not explicit, if we sort of like just apply it as a framework to the same system, we haven't really transformed the system. We've just provided a framework.
So let's talk a little bit about Pillar 4 and ensuring students are learning. So, you know, it was really the least attended to of the pathways pillars, in part because I think it's the hardest, because you're thinking about how like teaching and learning is happening in classrooms throughout your institution. There's lots and lots of faculty involved. So when you think about, you know, scaling this work and thinking about what are we scaling, it's a lot more complicated than thinking about scaling a new advising system or scaling a new onboarding system. So can you share, maybe Rosie, we'll start with you, a little bit about, you know, what have you learned through kind of thinking about, you know, ensuring that teaching and learning is part of the pathways framework?
I think some of the biggest lessons and ongoing lessons that I've learned, that we've learned as an organization, have really truly been around faculty engagement. not just around teaching and learning and evolution of practices and things like that, but really it's been around that cultural practice or cultural environment by which we effectively can engage one another and engage faculty in particular around teaching and learning. And I think that each college, I think this is where it's been important to recognize that every single one of us is doing it in our own, while we have our own unique contexts, and that might mean that some of the fruit was lower hanging than other colleges, or like for us, we had fruit that's higher up the tree than it was for other colleges, so we lagged. We're still lagging in some of the implementation of interventions where others haven't or have maybe tackled it first. But we all have while we all have very unique environments in which we engage with our faculty, I think the common element to that has been that the faculty context, the classroom, is a place that's hyper focused on students, and their availability for time and engagement it can be very different college to college based on the contracts, based on the culture as well. And so really, for us having to crack the nut of really understanding what did it mean, and I'm in a multi-college district, faculty engagement did not look the same, even within the same district at the 3 colleges that we represent. And so it was really a matter of learning and adjusting and then being consistent. And I think some of the ways that we've been able to build consistency in how faculty are engaged in any element of planning and reform work has been around resourcing the ability to bring them on board. So having funding, using funding for faculty stipends, and being really intentional about bringing faculty to the table and supporting the work that they're doing at that table that's beyond the classroom work or beyond the committee work that might already be included in their role in their responsibilities as tenured faculty. So I think the big learning lesson has been to really hone for each college, what did faculty engagement mean for you? What did effective faculty engagement mean for you? And then how do you resource that so that it can be consistent and it can be counted on over time, so that faculty know that this isn't going to be something that's just, we have it now because we have this funding source and it's going to go away later, but that this is something that the college is really committed to. I also think that it's also been a matter of really leaning into our faculty are the best experts in what is going to be better and more effective for their fields. And so they talk with one another, and they know what kind of improvements they want to implement, and don't always have a sense of where are the resources to implement these. And so it's been a matter of having the framework to really guide the direction we want to go, but really relying on faculty expertise to define what that path is. And certainly it not being a top-down or from the side over a direction of what sort of changes needed to happen, but something that really comes from within the faculty community and from faculty voice. So I think that continues to be work that we have to do for engagement for all employees, but it's been, as you know, particularly important to get that right for the purposes of improving the teaching and learning outcomes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the teaching and learning and faculty development work at Pierce?
Yeah, I mean, in thinking about like ensure students are learning, for us, we had a fairly robust structure for this already in our outcomes assessment model. And it was rather seamless. We basically made all of our curriculum and pedagogy work, guided pathways work, by design, and we already had a team working on that. So it was sort of a like, hey, we're living under this new like framework, and now how do we build on that? So it was central to the work of teaching and learning. We were able to apply the new framework, and I think that led us to seeing where we needed greater refinement, greater organization, greater transparency, particularly with regard to the outcomes goals of the curriculum, which included pedagogy. So we shifted to start interrogating outcomes with the same anti-racist approach as evaluating policy, because curriculum is policy in that way, asking specific questions about how a particular outcome might marginalize or discriminate or harm, how program design works to advance equity, and then making meaningful changes to change those designs, those outcomes, et cetera. So to that end, this is also where we shifted to make inclusive pedagogies and hiring explicitly focused on Black and Brown student excellence, and then built those structures around them that were faculty professional development. How that got built in, we completely overhauled the tenure process. So now if you're going to pursue tenure at Pierce College, the first thing you have to demonstrate is action toward advancing Black and Brown student excellence. So what does that look like pedagogically? What does that look like in your field and your outcomes for your courses? How are you engaging workforce in changing how the field is thinking around equity? So it's not just this little ecosystem at Pierce College, but once I step out into the field or once I transfer, how do I know that I'm going to be able to both have the agency in that space to engage in that structure and push against and not be destroyed by it, right? So I think that element of professional development for faculty, of that learning element of how we're thinking about all of that together as a part of the inclusive pedagogy framework that we developed, is now advancing that work even more quickly around. I think we started very much on the mapping idea. So ensure students were learning was tied to the outcomes in courses, but we quickly transitioned to the, I can draw those outcomes all day long, but if I still have racist practices in my classroom, the outcomes are not going to shift for equity. And so how are we transitioning and how are we transforming as professionals in the field of education to change the dynamic and really respond to the students that are seeking us for justice?
So we only have a couple minutes left, but I want to ask you if you could briefly tell us, where are you going next? What's your big, goals for the next year or two? Rosie, you want to go first?
From that last. Oh, go ahead, Rosie.
Oh yeah,
sorry.
No, go, Matt.
Continue
Mine's
on.
quick and easy because it translates really quickly from the last one. We talked about inclusive pedagogy. We changed that language to be inclusive practices, and now we're applying that same framework or an adjusted framework in every corner of the institution, because it doesn't just happen in the classroom, right? What's the impact for a student when they walk into a financial aid office? What's inclusive practice look like there? So those are the big that's the big focus I would say we have at this moment, is really thinking around pedagogy as practice for everybody who works in the community and technical college system.
And I'm going to turn back to something that Davis said early on and Pete queried about in the chat, and that is that our district has gone through, and I know we're not alone, but we have gone through significant leadership transformation and change. And so much of it is a matter of, and we have really strong teams that are keeping the guided pathways work going, and doing, we just did a recent updated presentation to our trustees, but really focusing on where have we been stuck. One thing I didn't get to talk about was the incredible value of coaching throughout this process. Michelle Andres is here. She's been our coach for a long time, and really appreciate the important role of that coach to come in and tell you sometimes what you can't see because you're in it, but also to reflect for you over time, especially as leadership and other positions may change, where you're stuck and where you've got great momentum. And I think so I will I'm wanting us to focus on some areas where we've been stuck for a long time and spinning our wheels. I won't get specific about that, but I just want to be honest with the group today that while we're making great progress and we've been at this a long time, we have suffered from the transitional changes in leadership and in so many roles across the organization. And my colleagues from Seattle Colleges, or who were recently with us at Seattle Colleges and work at other institutions now, know that that's had a wear on us. I know that's the case for many colleges in the system, and so really focusing on really surviving these transformations. We're interviewing president finalists this week, next week, and the week after for 3 college presidencies, but really looking forward to a stabilization in leadership that's going to carry us through the next phase of this work. And much of that will be to really look at and examine where have we gotten stuck? What are the things that we can do? What are the brave things we need to do to get unstuck so we can advance on some of those things that were perhaps lower hanging fruit on the tree for others, but were much higher up than we realized when we started out on the guided pathways work. So how's that for an ambiguous answer?
I love it. Yeah, I think it is, this work is continuously evolving. I mean, we continue to learn about what these practices look like, how they can be improved, and where to go next. So I appreciate that. But I just want to thank you both so much for sharing your insight and your expertise and your thoughts with us today. I really appreciate it. And, you know, we have learned so much from all the colleges in Washington, and we continue to do so. So we will share the reports with you. Please reach out to me and Davis if you have any other questions. Pete, happy to talk more about leadership if you want some time. And anyone else, please feel free to email us. Our emails will be in the slides, which we will get out as well. So thank you all so much.
Thank you all.